4. Create space for what really matters. Last year, while flying across the country, I struck up a conversation with a fellow passenger who reminded me again that it's never about the stuff. We started with the usual pleasantries typical of a first encounter, and early on I detected a deep sadness in this woman. She said she had just been visiting family for Thanksgiving and that it had been a long time since she'd travelled so far. I'll admit, sometimes when I tell people what I do for a living, they wonder what satisfaction I could possibly get out of helping strangers declutter their homes and deal with all of that, well, junk. I quickly remind these people that for me it's not so much about decluttering homes as it is about decluttering entire lives. For me, it's all about helping people reframe their relationship to what they own, so that the focus is no longer on the quantity of stuff, but on the quality of their relationships. The woman on the airplane, whom I'll call Ellie, recognised me from a segment I had done on the Oprah Winfrey Show, and tearfully asked me for help. Ellie seemed very put together, but quickly, as she shared with me the details of her recent life, I realised that looks could be deceiving. As she talked, I felt as though I were the first person she trusted to open up to about her problems and sorrows. I sat there listening, knowing the best thing I could do for her now was just to sit and hear her story. Ellie had suffered 2 devastating losses that year. 2 weeks after she celebrated her firstborn son's wedding high on a hilltop outside San Diego, her newlywed son was killed in a freak car accident. No more than a month after that, her husband of 40 years was diagnosed with terminal cancer and lived for just 3 months. For the first time in her adult life, Ellie was alone, though she still had 2 other grown children. Ellie explained that she barely recognised herself anymore. She'd gained nearly 40 pounds in the past 6 months, had let herself go, and her home was rotting. She wouldn't let her other children help her, and they lived far enough away they couldn't see how she was living or how far she had slipped from her previous life. It had been 8 months since she'd buried her husband, and Ellie had pretty much withdrawn from society during that time in order to deal with her pain. I scheduled a visit with Ellie that very next day. She happened to live only about 30 miles from me in Los Angeles. From the outside of her house, where she had lived for nearly as long as she'd been married, I could tell that this had been a home of homes. It was the place she had raised her children and nursed her late husband through his final days. It was where all of her life's memories clung to every nook and cranny. But this wasn't a happy home anymore, at least from what I could see when I arrived. It had become overrun by stuff that reflected Ellie's recent losses and pain. Clearly, the dual tragedies had paralysed her, and she was living in inactive mode. While taking me on a house tour, Ellie spoke in terms of before and after, telling me she'd been an avid house cleaner and stoic shopper who previously never let clutter invade her space. She had been good with money and had worn the CEO hat in the family for decades. I believed all this to be true, but it was hard to imagine those days when looking at the state of her house. Now she couldn't find that industrious manager's hat to save herself. She'd let bills go unpaid because she couldn't face the paperwork. Her savings had been used up from paying the medical bills and funeral costs, and because her husband had been the breadwinner, she had no income outside of Social Security and his insurance policy. Ellie still didn't have a job, nor did she seem to have the inclination to look for one. Part of her was still trying to live as though her circumstances had not changed, but part of her was no longer functioning. Unanswered mail had piled up, and the kitchen looked as though someone had been camping out for months. She had turned one of the bedrooms into a shrine dedicated to her late son. Her husband's clothes still filled the closets. His toiletries were strewn across the bathroom sink and bedroom vanity. Ellie hadn't been able to move or touch anything for fear of losing the memories. Until now, that is. After she gave me a tour of her home, she turned to me and said, "I'm ready, Peter. I really am." I held her hands in reassurance. I knew she was finally ready to create space for what really mattered. Ready for change. Though you may not see yourself in Ellie or think your life is nearly as bad as hers, I bet you'd be able to find plenty of similarities if you looked closer. In most of the people I work with, there's a common theme: a sense of loss, for whatever reason, and an inability to take charge of one's life. You may not be mourning the loss of family members, but dealing with the loss of a lifestyle you once lived can be plenty to shoulder. Letting bills pile up, avoiding the personal and physical upkeep you should be doing in your life, and letting yourself go are all challenges that I see routinely in people. And the solution for each and every one of them, regardless of personal issues and circumstances, is usually the same: taking slow, methodical steps to reclaim a healthy, organized, and financially and emotionally fit life again. Ellie's readiness for change was the first critical step in actually making changes. She committed to and embraced the need for change. This will also be your first important step. Until we are ready, we can hear the message, but never accept it as real, so we never change. This happens all the time in the diet world. Resources and advice on weight loss abound, but we still suffer from obesity. Anyone who has ever lost a significant amount of weight and kept it off has succeeded in one simple thing: redefining his or her relationship with food. The same holds true in terms of our possessions or money. Once you redefine your relationship to what you own and how you spend money, you can make a lasting, permanent shift in your life. If there's not a personal desire for change, however, there's no point even getting started. The desire for something different, something better, has to first come from within yourself. If you've gotten this far in the book, you have to ask yourself whether or not you are ready to make changes. These changes will mean dealing with all the emotions that are tied up in your relationships, your physical stuff, your financial hardships, and so on. Getting organized for the sake of getting organized is a waste of time. So is cleaning up your garage to make room for an old piece of furniture you now have to store because you just bought a new one for the living room. Paying a single bill just to get rid of it is beside the point. And so is creating an elaborate filing system and an organized space to pay bills that you never routinely use. Taking charge of any single area in your life should lead to much bigger, loftier goals. It should also affect more than just that one area you're trying to clean up. The various aspects of our lives, emotional, financial, physical, and so on, are all interrelated. If we fix how we organize our home, we have to fix how we handle money and finances. If we address our feelings and sources of tension, we have to address what we think about our possessions and how we value what we choose to buy and maintain. Though we may not set specific targeted goals for any one area of our life, each goal should ultimately help us live a richer, less stressed, more happy and focused life. Now those are goals worth pursuing. As you're no doubt beginning to do as you listen, I took Ellie through the process of understanding why she'd let her life go so awry. Often with a life overwhelmed by clutter, there is some trauma that has precipitated it all. Some event that throws you and your life off track, and Ellie was no different. Clearly, the emotional impact of her losses had been monumental enough to derail her life. When such a trauma hits, the stuff you own can become a way of insulating yourself from the pain and the overwhelming confusion of dealing with each day. What losses or traumas have affected you? Can you see a connection between certain circumstances in your life and how you've lost control of that life along the way? Do you harbour a hidden sadness or aggression that has changed how you'd like to live? As with so many of the people I deal with, I first gave Ellie permission to accept how she had chosen to grieve. This may sound odd, but often people look to me for some permission that they are not able to give themselves. The permission to let go, the permission to move on, the permission to say no, or just the permission to accept that they are worthy of a better life. I also encouraged Ellie to reframe how she could celebrate her husband and son in a way that gave her back her life and yet also honoured and respected their memory. She knew it was time to pick herself up and find a new normal. She just couldn't do it herself. Although I was a stranger to her, I was a neutral third party who could intervene on her behalf and help her to take stock of her things, her emotions, and her life in a way she knew she could not. At the end of the first day working with Ellie, I was amazed by the light that came back into her eyes. She looked as if she'd just been liberated from a prison. Though her grief was still very present and real, she could separate her emotions from the things and put those things in their proper place. It's always amazing to see what happens when you remove clutter from someone's life. I've said it often, but it's hard to imagine what great things flow into a space once the clutter is removed. This was so true for Ellie. More space, more light, a more optimistic outlook had increased her hope for the future and given her a sense of peace and calm and, perhaps most importantly, a sense that she had her life back. It wouldn't be the same life, but it would be a life she could enjoy. Ellie even began to contemplate jobs she could apply for, hoping to secure a regular flow of income once again. Together, we also tackled her stacks of bills and reorganized her bill-paying system. For Ellie, writing a check to pay that first overdue bill was all she needed to get going again in that department. It was like the law of inertia. She'd been stuck for a long time and simply needed a little push to get her back on track. Again, this is not unusual. No matter what form the clutter takes, it's often about just getting started, about seeing that you can turn things around. I reminded Ellie that getting back on track was not only doing something for herself, but would ultimately enable her to live the best life that she could, preserving her family's legacy and honouring those closest to her who had passed away. My hope is that you too can turn your life around using the same step-by-step methods I used with Ellie. You've already begun the process, and now it's just a matter of continuing onward with your own determination and a fearless attitude. Dear Peter, I will be turning 55 in May, and I have finally found my freedom in having less. But in having less, I am learning to buy what I use and use what I buy. Rather than having a pantry, cabinet, or closet full of items that I don't ever use, I now have only items that I need, with more space in those places. As I'm working my way through our home, it's making me feel less cluttered. I'm not 100% there, but 85%. My father died a couple of years back. We had to sell the home, and now my mom rotates between our home and that of two of my siblings. We have divided up their 61 years of stuff. As I look at the things my dad decided to move around for his entire adult life, I hear you saying, if it's so valuable, why has it rotted in a box? Or why do you have it in a box? Thanks for your help over the years in the shows you've been on, giving me the equipment to face things. Your personal life is multi-dimensional.